I could be a typical sort of academic glib by saying, you know, that project of bringing together all the data, I've done that. But in this case, it's actually true. And so I'm really hoping that that can help somewhat. So I wanted to talk very briefly about a project that I've just finished. In part, it's a book that you can see up there. There's some flyers in the lobby. But if you just want the data, you can get that from me as well, just for free, of course. What I've been doing in the last 6 years is bringing together every single report or data point that I could find from around the world about working conditions in relation to wellness and well-being in 6 media professions. The screen industry, so film, audiovisual, documentary, TV, journalism, advertising, marketing and PR, digital games, music and recording, and social media entertainment, so vloggers and influencers. And the most important thing about that, I would say, in that project, one is you're not special. That is that the percentages of people in those industries reporting the things that Maximilian highlighted in his keynote about poor or, as you said, degrading working conditions, lack of fair pay, the consistent experience of having to work under unrealistic expectations, and a whole host of other related issues are the same in all those industries. And of course there are individualized exceptions. I mean, one thing that I've found is that you can have the same company, within that company, let's say a software design studio, you have a team somewhere on the left of the building who are high-fiving their way through projects, and around the corner is a team where half of them are at home with burnout and suicidal ideation symptoms. And they're working under the same management, the same rules, the same money, the same everything. So, and what Maximilian said, I think, was really powerful. He said, you know, the diversity issue is a systemic situation in the industry, and I think that's what this project was highlighting for me, is that well-being or the lack thereof in relation to work is a systemic problem. It's not a people problem. And I know that I'm not telling you anything new, because what I'm telling you is what you've told me. I mean, all the data that I have comes from you, right? And this is another thing, with the exception of very few people like you, Sam, I mean, but very few people in academia study this, right? I mean, there's amazing work done on well-being and work around the world, but none of that applies to creative work. And now that's slowly beginning to change, mostly for journalists. They're always privileged as sort of a profession that we should study. But so my work comes from trying to find a way to figure out both what the problem is exactly, in terms of the experience of people working in these industries. Secondly, how did we get this far? What explains the problem? And here I think our explanations differ somewhat. I mean, you look at industrial and economic and financial situations. I'm looking more at managerial, like the way the production, media production is organized. And I think that's where also a major culprit is. And that's easier to fix than the industrial financial issue. And in the book, I'm trying to document the exact nature of the consequences. Because we can talk about, well, this is not very good for your mental health if you're dealing with this on a long term, or you can't pay the bills if you do this for too long, or you're on hiatus for endlessly, or you're not getting paid fairly. But that actually, to me, glosses over what the real consequences are, including this number of women, gender parity, and parity on most socioeconomic and ethnic and all kinds of other indicators in film schools or journalism schools or whatever. And then after 3 years in the industry, they're all gone. And I mean, I have an Australian colleague. Her name is Deb Verhoeven, which is an incredibly Dutch name, but she is Australian. And she and her team have been collecting data on the global film industries for the last 20 years or so. And they found that on average, 80% of all people in film and television disappear after one production. 80%. I don't know if you know this, but the average length of a career in journalism is 3 to 5 years, and then everybody's gone. In Hollywood, 80%, also 80% of everybody entering, I used to work in LA for 10 years at USC, so 80% of people in film production studios are gone within a year. And which is the reason why it's so easy to get a job in the industry, right? Because the industry knows that you're going to leave within a year. And that turnover, that churn, which is, I mean, advertising is the same. And that's built into the system. That's the model. And that is sort of a hint of where the systemic nature of the problem is. Now, the second thing I learned from doing this project, other than in the process getting pretty depressed myself, and also realizing that everything I learned about the media industry applies to the university as well. The second thing I learned is, I'll give you an example. Last year there was a survey done among professionals in the Australian screen industries. So everybody from crew to acting, above the line, below the line, everybody was involved. A couple of thousand responses, very representative survey. The percentage of people in that survey indicating whether they felt this industry that they worked in was a healthy place to work. 72% said no, absolutely not, like vehemently no. Now, you guess what the percentage was of those people saying, I'm so happy I get to do this? It's the same, well, even more, 77. And the thing is, that's the pattern across all these reports as well. I'll give you another example. The year before that, there was a survey done by the Pew Center in the United States among close to 11,000 American journalists, working journalists. 77%, same percentage almost, said they would choose this career all over again if they had the choice. The percentage of those people who were, when they were asked to use a word to describe your industry, 72% used the word with a negative term, and the most often used words were chaos and struggle. Wow. Now, the subtitle of my book is "What makes you happy can also make you sick," because that's the paradox, right? That's also why talking about solutions is really difficult, and that's why collective organization, even though we all agree that's important, is so hard, because there are the same people who are struggling are the people who are happy. And that's weird, but that also makes it hard for policymakers to really get excited about solving this problem, because they will get pushback from the very people whose lives they're trying to improve. I'm not saying that we are guilty of making this difficult, but it is interesting to see how can you change this discussion. I don't want to talk too much because I was inspired by the discussion before. I'm hoping we can have some time to talk about this together. But I just want to tell you that after I compiled all this data, and I've compiled about close to 400 of these kind of reports and surveys, some of them were mentioned today. I've done my own interviews. I've talked to mental health charities and nonprofits that dedicate themselves to media industries. There are all over the world that are doing all kinds of amazing work, both nationally and internationally. If you want to know more about it, I run a YouTube channel, and all my interviews are on YouTube with those people from Screenwell in Australia, or the Behind the Scenes Foundation in the United States that some of you may be familiar with, or with the Film and TV Charity in the UK, or Cinemind, which is an organization in my home country, the Netherlands. And then not just in film, but also in music and in journalism. And all these, every industry has a plethora, I always wanted to use that word, of organizations ever since the Three Amigos. But so I got all this data, right? And I had done all these interviews, and I got my fancy little academic insights, and I was stuck. I was stuck on this paradox. Right? So what now? Other than let's form a global union, which is the solution to pretty much everything in the world, but it's not going to happen. So I became, in the process of doing a project for my university, I became friends with a colleague who worked at the Amsterdam, this is purely by chance, at the Amsterdam University Medical Center. And we hit it off because we found out we were both into metal. And bicycling and metal creates bonds across boundaries. It's my personal passion. Anyways, so we were like, yeah, what was the last gig you went to? And exchanging bands and everything. So I said, so what kind of work do you do? She said, I'm a professor of occupational medicine. I don't know about you, but I didn't know what that was. I mean, long story short, occupational medicine is a discipline that started with the gladiator fights in ancient Rome. Oh. Why? Because there's you use gladiators to appease the people, right? But the problem is gladiators die fairly quickly and quite often. That's not a very good investment. It's a bit like Netflix wanting to do more with fewer people. It's like, well, that is ultimately, and that's why you were so right. It's not in their best interest to run after the cheapest conditions because people will burn out too quickly and that's expensive. It's cynical, but it's expensive. Anyways. So they came up with special equipment specific for gladiators that you can't use for an army in the field because they have to look alike, but specific for gladiators that would keep them alive for longer. That's where occupational medicine comes from. Hard hats on construction sites, right? Because to have construction workers die is not very helpful. By the way, I'm sorry, this sounds glib, and I have a fever, so that's my problem. But I'm saying this actually quite deliberately because the top 3 professional groups in any country that measures this around the world that score the highest when it comes to occupation-related suicide are construction workers, nurses, and media workers. So we all know, you've probably heard of the 27 Club. Right, it's this horrible name for musicians that die at the age of 27. Chris Cornell, Janis Joplin, Ian Curtis, Jimi Hendrix, you all know that. Well, the average age of musicians, thankfully, is 56, which is my age, and I am a musician, so I'm a bit scared. But, but there is a point to be made that when did these people die? They on tour. Right? And this is the thing I found across all these professions. The aspect of the work that most people aspire to is the aspect which gets them killed. Touring for musicians, it's doing conflict and war reporting for journalists, and so on and so forth. Being in a super intense, incredibly rewarding shoot with a film that at some point just burns you out, to burn too brightly, right? Even though that's what you want to do. And again, it's that paradox. Anyways, she was telling me occupational medicine, and she was also telling me that up until the late 20th century, all they studied were ways to physically protect workers. And then in the 70s and 80s, something began to shift, and they started to notice that what actually was causing much more problem were mental health issues related to work. So not related to your own pathology, but to the work. And she and her team, she's told me, started to do meta-reviews every 10 years where they get primary data from studies on workplace-related stressors from around the world, plus secondary data, published articles and books, and to try to build a model of what explains people getting sick at work. Such a beautifully simple question, right? What things at work can predictably lead to people getting sick? Now, what is so important about this question is that I'm using the word sick. So this is not people feeling stressed out or what was said earlier, needing a break a little bit after a big project. No, people who can't work anymore, who are sitting at home with a medical diagnosis. So it's like a over-the-top kind of like compilation of stress, burnout, feeling depressed because of work, feeling anxious, or those kind of things. And she and her team came up with a model of 3 variables that together explain 60 to 80% of work-related disease. Now, I don't know how good you are with statistics, but an explained variance of 60 to 80% is the holy grail. Normally, when statistics, you're lucky if you can explain 15% of what you're studying. But 60 to 80% means this model is rock solid. Now, she was telling me this model, and I literally got goosebumps, because she was telling me about things at work that are extremes, outliers, things that are really bizarre, but if they happen, and they happen a lot over time, can make employees sick. But I thought she was defining the way media industries work. In other words, these are the basic foundations of how the industry is structured. And so if I'm right, then what I say now, should you go like, well, yeah, duh, dude, this is how it works. So I'll test it out. 3 variables. The first one, if there's a structural lack of reciprocity. And what that means is that if there's an imbalance between what people bring to the work and what the work gives back. And that's both material, as in fair pay, decent working conditions, that you get paid to retrain yourself because there's now this bloody AI thing that you need to do, or, those kind of things. So materialistic aspects of the work. And affective or emotional aspect is like, hey man, you did a great job, or thanks for your hard work, why don't you take a couple of weeks off? Or in other words, recognition, right? How do you know whether you've done a good job? Generally you don't, or unless you get drunk with a bunch of people afterwards. So, so lack of reciprocity. If you experience that on a structural level, sooner or later you burn out. Second variable is organizational justice, or the lack thereof. Organizational justice is the reality or perception, again the material and the emotional aspect, that the decisions that are being made about you, your colleagues, or about the work are fair, just, transparent, that there's an accountability system in place, that it's democratic, that you have a role to play, that you're taken seriously, that you have a voice, that you, well, I don't know about you, but I have never heard media professionals talk about decision making in their organization in that way. And I used to be a journalist before I became academic. I'm an amateur musician. That doesn't really mean much, but I do know the music industry quite up and close and personal. There's nothing fair about it. No. It's not. I don't want to again be cynical, but there is an element of things like nepotism and all that kind of stuff in play. And isn't it odd that all the major stars have cousins and sons and daughters that are fantastic in these industries? And I'm sure Denzel Washington's son is a brilliant actor. God bless him. But it's a bit weird. Anyway, so lack of reciprocity, organizational justice, or the lack thereof. And the third one is unusually high workloads. Now, here's where a nuance comes in. Because, I don't know about you, but what I found, especially working with students, and I've taught and worked in the US, in Germany, in South Africa, Australia, and now in the Netherlands, is that the workload is partly the motivation. Like the idea of with a group of friends working towards a deadline, getting that story in, or finishing the shoot, preferably on time, or going gold when you're working in a game studio, you're trying to get that game, or releasing your thing and just pulling in a couple of all-nighters. It's part of the fun. It's part of the excitement. Of course, it's the adrenaline. So unusually high workloads are not in and of itself the problem. The problem if they get paired, and that's where the beauty of my friend Karen's team's research comes in, with little or no what they call status control. And status control is that you have, or that you feel that you have, some autonomy over what you get to do on the projects, how you get to do it on your projects. That's right. And I know from other surveys that the number one thing that media professionals, regardless of whether they're journalists, filmmakers, crews, technicians, advertising creatives, game developers or designers, what they all share are two things. And that's why, in a way, the professional backgrounds don't differ. They share a desire to tell stories, preferably their own, or the ones that they care about, and secondly, to be left alone while doing so. Right? Autonomy. To have to do it exclusively at the behest of some financier or for some crazy narcissist or whatever, but just because you're doing it for the love of the work, and if that gets taken away, but the workload keeps going up, then at some point you break. Now, lack of reciprocity, organizational injustice, and a combination of high workload and low status control or low autonomy is, for me, the definition of media management. And so, in other words, the people who manage to survive this industry are not necessarily the best filmmakers, the best journalists, and some of them obviously are, the people in this room, but are the people who somehow, through a combination of characteristics, both emotional and material, can survive this. They're the fittest, to quote Darwin, right? And that's where the diversity problem comes in, right? Because I don't know about you, but the newsrooms I've been in, the studios I've been in, the agencies I've been in, the last people I find there who are like hardcore racists, sexists, ageists, ableists or whatever. They tend to be the most well-educated, well-meaning, often progressively thinking, absolutely. You talk diversity, they all cheer. Yes, absolutely. That's, and still, our sector scores the highest of all economic sectors on its diversity issues. Discrimination, bullying, misconduct, transgressive behavior, rape. I mean, all of those numbers are through the roof when it comes to creative industries. And so to me, and also talking to my psychologist friends, like, those are maladaptive coping responses. That's a sign of a sick way of working. If you're under that much pressure and you have nowhere to turn to, and there's no reciprocity, and there's no justice, and the workload keeps going up, that has to go somewhere. I'm not making this okay.
No.
But I find that, again, what Maximilian said at the beginning, it's a systemic issue. It's not a people issue. Yes, some horrible white guys need to go, obviously. But that doesn't solve anything, right? So that model, those three variables, really for me opened my eyes to, well, that's not just, to me, doesn't just explain why the numbers of people suffering in this industry is so high. It also explains why the numbers of people still loving and being thankful for getting to do this are so high. Why? Because it's the only thing you've got, right? It's literally the only thing you've got. If you wouldn't love this, then you would be insane. I mean, I don't know about you, but I know so many people, media professionals in the US and the Netherlands that I've worked with, who would tell me, once we become friends, they would literally say to me, Mark, I can't explain what I do to my parents. And not just because they don't get film or something like that, but they don't get working under these conditions. The only thing I have is, yeah, but I love doing this. These people I'm doing is that they're my family, right? And so if that's the only thing you've got, then you have to, and so this to me is my last point. If the love for the work is the only thing you've got, because everything else gets rotten because of the lack of reciprocity, organizational injustice, and the combination of workload and lack of autonomy, and we can agree that this is not your problem, because you are a snowflake or you can't handle it or whatever, but it's a systemic issue, then this is what the industry uses against you, right? Your love for the work gets used, not by a handful of evil executives, because there's plenty of executives that mean really well. And I mean, the few studies I've seen among leadership and media organizations tend to suggest that the people who become leaders who want to do well feel stuck because they can't. Either they are not supported, they don't have finances, or once they become leaders and they're going to be nice, their workers don't trust them. Because like, wait a minute, you've been an asshole all the way to the top, and now you're going to help me? Fuck you, right? So leaders are stuck too. So that's why in our field, in our discipline, your love is often used as an explanation as the problem. Right? If you read the academic literature, again, the relatively little academic literature on all of this, it tends to say, well, the reason why precarious working conditions don't really change is because the people who have these conditions are so passionate that they're willing to accept exploitative working circumstances. That's what academics tend to say. Bullshit! You're not here because you're willingly accepting precarious working conditions. You don't go to the bar and don't complain about this. Of course you do. But your love is focused on each other and the thing you're making, the story you're telling. What if this love can be redirected towards the industry that you're part of? And that's already happening. That's one of the things why these kind of events, I mean, since the book came out, I've been to close to 100 of these kind of events, and that's mostly just in my home country. So something is brewing, and not just in your field, in all these fields. So with the European Film Academy, I'm very encouraged to say, like, yeah, get together in all kinds of different formal and informal ways, but also across industry lines, because you're all in this shit together. And the reason why love is so important, not as a problem, but as a solution, is something, my last thing that I found out while doing this project, and I'm an old white guy, so that's why I only come to this now. I should have started with this. So I don't know about you, but there is an academic discipline called love studies. And I used to think that, well, these are people that study romance novels or something like that, and that's beautiful. But no. It's, and I'm sure some of you know this, but the reason why there's an academic discipline in love studies is because they realize that love is not a feeling. Love is a transformative force, right? If you're in love, you do stuff you would normally never ever do. Move to Australia. And stuff like that. I've done that. So, and my friends would go like, no, again? And like, yeah, she's really pretty. No, but right? And so that transformative force now powers an industry that doesn't care about you. Not the people in the industry do, but the industry structure doesn't. Because it's built around things that we know from occupational medicine predictably make most people sick. That's an industry that doesn't care, right? So you can use that model and use love to change the variables in that model. Lack of reciprocity, in part, of course it means fair pay, but it also means sort of opening up the conversation about recognition and reward. And like, for example, a film producer telling me, now, well, one thing I do, I know I don't have a whole lot of money, but what I can do is at the start of a shoot, just check in with everybody individually. What do you need to do your best work, and how can I help? It's something very simple, but it can be transformative, right? At least it's based in love, and not love for the film, but love for the crew member that you're working with. I'm not saying that never ever happens, but it's generally the exception. Organizational injustice, well, come up with a couple of transparent protocols. Make your decision maker transparent. Include your people. Set up some kind of accountability mechanism. They do this really well in journalism. They don't do it in many other media professions. Why don't you take a cue from our journalistic friends? And then thirdly, the workload and autonomy, give people more control over how they do things. Trust your workers because they're all passionate about the final project. Yeah, and it will be riskier, but the reward will be higher. So anyways, that's what's in the book. and thank you so much for listening.
I guess just like one quick question, and then I'll open it up because I think you guys are going to have questions. I'm more in the journalist industry, and what I've seen, over the years is people who are getting out have found some alternatives in journalism where they can be happier, let's put it that way. So, for instance, the creation of podcasts and the creation of Substacks and all these things where they have more autonomy, much more than they did working, for big institutions. Is that something, but it's hard to do that in, the film industry or something like that. So, but have you seen this, this kind of shift that technology maybe is a good thing for allowing people to have more autonomy in their field?
Well, the best example for that is the games industry. Games industry of all the media industries is the most profitable. It's also the industry that in the last 2 years, almost half of all game developers in the world have lost their jobs the last 2 years. Why? It's the industry calls this a post-pandemic correction, right? During the pandemic, the only thing we did was Xbox and PlayStation. And so all the major studios pumped all their money into the development of new games. Of course, after the pandemic, we all realized we want to go outside and hang out with people again. And so most of these productions were shut down. This happens quite typically in the game industry. And also in the last 2 years, with one exception, all the major game publishers have been taken over by private equity firms, mostly from Saudi Arabia. Electronic Arts was just a couple of weeks ago.
What is a game industry?
Oh, sorry. Yeah,
Video games.
Actually, it works the same way as movies. It works the same way as music. Media industries, although they're very different, are structured very similarly. So you have 4 or 5 global publishers. So those you see the logos on the back of games, and you have hundreds of thousands tiny little studios that actually make games, and there's nothing in between. And that's kind of how so if you're a small studio, you make a game. In order to get your game on the Xbox, on the PlayStation, or on your iPhone, you have to go through a publisher, and the publisher then sort of secures access to these platforms. And some of these platforms also fund their own games. Microsoft in particular does that, but it's minor compared to the games that they buy. Like distributors in movies, right? They don't make movies, they distribute them. And that's a different kind of deal that you're then doing. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning games is that what has been happening, partly as a response to all these big studios being taken over or being shut down, is that indie games are massively popular. So indie games are games that are made by a handful of friends, and they put it on a platform like Steam, which is free. And then people can play them and pay as they go, or just like, €2 for a little game on your mobile phone or something like that. And it's tremendously successful. Now, of course, these people don't earn millions or even tens of thousands, but they earn enough to keep doing what they find is important to do. And that's an interesting reference, right? I mean, we were talking about film schools earlier. I mean, and I do it too. I run a journalism school. So when my team gets guests in, they get award-winning investigative reporters from national TV news shows, right? Yeah, and that happen to be alumni. That's lovely. But what the fuck kind of example is that, right? 99% of journalists are working for a little local thing and having to combine their work with being a barista somewhere. So that should be the example that we're setting, right? And in other words, yes, turning your creativity in a career is beautiful and it's wonderful. But could it also be a local career, a tiny little career, a career just for your community? You were saying so beautifully about there should be a white book of best practices. And I can say that with a couple of colleagues, we're putting a special issue of an academic journal together exactly for this purpose. So we'll definitely interface. But one example here, like you talked about journalists as well, is over the last 10, 15 years or so, in a lot of countries all over the world, including here in France, Mediapart in France is a great example. Journalists, sometimes new journalists, sometimes established one, broke away from often their jobs to set up tiny little companies on their own. The Correspondent in the Netherlands is a good example of that. I mean, there's Publico, not Publico, Politico in the US, of course, Vox, and there's even startups like that in Nepal, and my team and I we've been to all of these startups and we wrote a book on it called Beyond Journalism. And it's obviously they're having a hard time making ends meet and they're struggling, but they're locally relevant. They kind of make it work for themselves, and all of them, regardless of what they're doing, had this story is like, trying to keep pace with the way the main industry is going with its working condition, the way they're treating us, the way we're being valued or not valued. Even though I might get a decent salary out of it, isn't worth it. And so their love went to creating a different kind of industry for themselves. And I'm not saying everybody can or should do that, but that does give me hope.
Yeah, I would say in journalism as well, that's what I've seen, I've seen film critics go and, find alternative things like creating a podcast, and
right.
And some of them are doing better than before, and they're definitely more fulfilled because they don't have those systemic issues that, But it's also, I would say, the select few who manage sometimes to make it in those new industries. It's still hard, either way. But at least you're not dealing with the unhappiness aspect of it.
Thank you very much, Mark, for this brilliant demonstration. We love what you said, and I think it's ring a bell in each of us. And I love the way you show us what is the mechanism and what is, with your study, how you can define this type of thing. I do it myself in my kitchen. But I thought that we are all people who love movies. We love movies, we love heroes, we love stories. And when we are doing this job, we became the heroes of our own stories. We say, somebody give us money to make a set, but they don't give us enough. They don't give us time enough. And suddenly we can become like a pilot of the Aeropostale, and we go through the land, mountain, and we will, and the mail will arrive. We'll do it. We can do it. And suddenly we know we won't do it, but we do it.
Right.
And finally, we got the goal, we make it. And so we became heroes. And so this is one of our engine. This is the way we are working.
Yep.
So your triangle is good. I guess it's probably the right thing. But the story we are telling to each other is that we are becoming Guillaume in the land and piloting our Latécoère through the storms. And I thank you because you make a kind of reasonable view of what is like a kitchen feeling, you know. Thank you very much.
You told about an evolution. You said the problem comes from the management, if I don't transform what you said. And I wanted to ask you if you had elements about managers, because in my researches, I often heard about a change of profile of the managers. And I started. Sorry, yes, that's it. I started a little research to know better who they are, and often in established companies, I saw producers coming from business schools, right? And I think it's quite new evolution comparing with the 60s or the 70s, and maybe it's a way also to understand what this transformation.
The problem isn't managers; it's the structure of the industry. So when I say management, I don't refer to human beings, but sort of acquired, achieved, and reproduced stories about how things are supposed to go. Kind of your story about how the kitchen is supposed to run, right? And the heroic nature of making it work under impossible or unrealistic circumstances. And I mean, the two types of, leaders, that's interesting is like in all these reports when the people who say in these surveys, like, I'm struggling because of the work as a musician or as a journalist or as a filmmaker or whatever, as a crew member. And when they're asked in these surveys, so what's the cause of all of this? The number one thing, or sorry, not the cause, what should be the remedy is like the leadership, right? Management needs to see me, needs to know this, needs to deal with it. That's generally the feedback that I get when I go to industry gatherings, is people say, you should talk to my editor, you should talk to my producer, you should talk to my line manager or to my agent, my studio head or whatever. And I sometimes do. And like I said earlier in my presentation, the leaders that I've talked to, there's very few media leadership studies, like academic research, but the ones that there are, fascinating that you're completely right. The two type of people that get to be leaders in media, generally speaking, are either they're brought in from the outside to streamline everything, the business school people, and as you know, ethics isn't taught at business schools, or empathy for that matter. I don't know if you know this, but the most used media management handbook for HR professionals in media industries in Europe is a book written by a professor at INSEAD here in Paris. Professor Annette Aris, she happens to be Dutch, happens to be a good friend of mine. And it's a 450-page book, and in the final chapter there's a line saying, like, in future editions, more attention should be paid to people. So 450 pages of managing a media company without any mention of people. Right? Now, that's the business school approach, and that speaks to what you're saying about financialization and industrialization. It's all about streamlining and that kind of stuff, and understandably, because it's a hard economy to work in. And the other types of people that get to be leaders in media they become leaders because they were great at what they did, at storytelling. Right? An investigative reporter becomes editor-in-chief of a news organization. Somebody who's really great with camera and storytelling becomes a director and all that kind of stuff, generally speaking. The problem with that is, of course, one, being a great storyteller doesn't mean you're a great leader or manager, necessarily. And the fact that that isn't acknowledged by the industry speaks to its lack of professionalization, despite its industrialization rhetoric. And secondly, the problem there is that the people who then become leaders because they're great storytellers are being told, either directly or they learn, that the way they always done things is the best or right way to do things. The problem, however, is that if I make a film with all of you, you have about 140 different ways of thinking about what good work would be. And if I don't acknowledge that, then 77% of you will be miserable and all of you will be grateful that you get a job, right? And that's the data that is in my book. Investing in professionalizing leadership and creating more, including modern ideas about leadership that are about empathic leadership, for example, would be a great step, and that's something that the industry can do. And I do see this happening here and there, and so I'm encouraged that I've just found out the other day that my book was being bought for managers at a media house, which is one of the largest publishers in Europe. So that they're like, hopefully they'll learn something, other than exploiting people more effectively. But yeah, but leadership is definitely an issue here. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on that one thing. Like, I do feel that there's a change, at least in the film industry. I'm talking more about America, in terms of empathy from leaders. I think a good example of it is you know, a lot of people have followed what happened with Harvey Weinstein, obviously, and you know, the Me Too movement. But there was another producer who, you know, basically lost his job and is no longer making films, not because of, you know, rape or sexual harassment or sexual assault, but because of the way he treated people. And there was a producer named Scott Rudin.
Oh, yeah.
And Scott Rudin, when I worked in New York in film, he was a legendary asshole. But everybody wanted to work for him because he made some of the best movies. He worked with the Coen brothers. He made The Social Network. You know, this is one of the, and he was a very smart guy, but he treated people like shit. And people would go, and if you actually did an internship at Scott Rudin's production company and you survived it, it was almost like a badge of honor. And this was acceptable for decades. And suddenly people mostly younger people started speaking out and saying, hey, this isn't acceptable anymore. And so for me, that was a huge change, because if you see now, and what I understand is happening in the US in the film industry, you know, people aren't accepting bad behavior like that, like they used to, and talking about just the way you treat people in a general way.
Well, maybe just very quickly, because I think this is such it's a great story and very like telling, right? And but it also speaks to something that I found really. Look, I've read autobiographies of American journalists from the 1880s, and there's this phenomenal book. It's called In the Dream Factory, written by an American anthropologist visiting Hollywood in 1950. And everything in there, you can copy paste it to 2025. So nothing that we talk about today has anything to do with Gen AI or streamers. Or yes, of course, they amplify things and accelerate things, but the systemic issues have always been there. So what has made this a topic in the last 5 to 10 years? And I think exactly where the 50/50 Collective is an incredible initiative comes from, right? It's Me Too. It's Black Lives Matter. It's the pandemic. During the pandemic, a lot of organizations started to check in with people and realizing things are not going well. But there's also, and I mean, yes, my students are little shits, but they're amazing because they want to talk about this stuff. So, and there is good empirical evidence that there's a new generation coming into the workforce that, yes, they're entitled, but they also expect more. And in part that has to do with the fact that work means more, right? You want meaning from work, so you expect more from work. But it also, and I know from all these mental health organizations that I've worked with on this project, is that the one thing they always tell me when I say like, okay, what's the sequence of what we do next? They say, well, it starts with normalizing the conversation. And I'm really hopeful that that's actually what's happening. A destigmatization, not just in these environments, but also on a set, in a production company, in a newsroom, that somebody says, hey, I don't think this is the right way to treat people. And they're not being immediately marginalized or sidelined, but like, yeah, that's actually true. You don't need to treat people like shit in order to get them to do their best work. In fact, that's the last thing you should do.
So I'm wondering if you think this is something that has gotten worse, or if it always has been, because it seems to me that for at least 30 years, everyone I know in film consistently says it's never been this bad. I mean, that is like you hear it over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And I'm suddenly wondering if that's just what the nature of the beast has always been. I'm curious.
My answer would be, I think, and you need an answer from both of us. But my idea would be that those three variables have always been in place, but they were kept in check by relatively stable industry structures and policies and markets on a national level. And since the mid-1990s, that has started to shift. right? The major international media policy event of the 1990s was when the rise of the World Wide Web, where most governments were like, fuck this, we're not going to do any of this, right? This is this newfangled digital whatever thing. Right now we're all happy with the Digital Services Act and all those kind of things. But, you know, digital was here in 1995, right? So that's how long it took for decent policies to emerge. So the complete deregulation of the global media industries, of copyrights, of the way digital was being used and policed and governed, started in that time. And what you're talking about, media concentration, which has always been an issue in the media industry, but it was always coupled with deconcentration. So companies were buying and selling properties, and that was kind of how they made it work. But since the 1990s, this has just accelerated to an insane pace. And that has created this term. So financialization, industrialization, these big developments that up until the mid-1990s were kind of kept in check by a relatively stable, also largely analog global media system, became digital and started to accelerate. And that has made this all bubble up to the surface and become the number one thing. So, because that's the thing, right? I mean, when you talk to media professionals in any industry about what the digital means to them, it's like they can, on the surface level, can talk about threats and opportunities and this is kind of cool and that kind of sucks, or no. But what it fundamentally means to them is just, yeah, well, things will get shittier now, right? I will have to do more with few people. We're gonna have to be, anyways, those kind of things. So, and that's what that's where this analysis for it's never been this bad comes from. Is that the things were bad always in decent, but they were kept in check, kind of, and that's now gone. So that's I think that would be my analysis of that sentiment. But it is a sentiment, and I think that's a sentiment we need to take seriously. Yeah, I feel that so personally. I mean, like I've been interviewing media professionals for my entire career, which is a little over 25 years. And only a couple of years ago, it just dawned on me. It's like I've always asked people, how do you make it work, right? How do you stay creative in an industry that doesn't really want you to be? That was always my research question. And people would tell me about all the things, and I was like, yeah, that's awesome. And then now I realize that, but all these interviews were really about well-being and health and happiness, but I never had the words. I mean, there's an advertising agency based in Amsterdam called the Home Agency. And the founder of that, Baba Touré, he makes a point of calling his agency a human first agency, because he said like, my clients can depend that there'll always be a human being on the phone and that we don't use AI in our campaigns. And that becomes his pitch, right? But it reminded me of all the news organizations in the last 20 years have made the pivot to digital first. We're not making newspapers or broadcasts or anything, we're digital first. But if you're digital first now, you might as well be AI. So now you have to go back to, oh shit, we have to pay unique journalists to come up with unique stories. So human first, yeah.